Okay. It's up to me now to keep us roughly on schedule. And I encourage all to stay until the end, not only to hear 4 very good papers, but also because the British ambassador will be scheduled to arrive at 4 o'clock to close the conference in a ceremonial way. I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference, for especially Yidi and Martin and Mira for a wonderfully intellectually stimulating conference so far, and also for structuring it well. We began in the Second Temple period, in the New Testament, and we then progressed, I guess, to parting of the ways. And it was not so simple as Martin showed us. In fact, given his model, it was rather chaotic and complicated. And now, at post-parting of the ways, but perhaps we're still parting of the ways, we're in late antiquity. We have 4 distinguished papers, or rather, we haven't heard the papers, so we have 4 papers from distinguished scholars. The first, 3 from Tel Aviv and 1 from Oxford. The first will be Yuval Shahar from the Department of Jewish History here in Tel Aviv, who will speak on what role did Christianity play in the world of Jews in Eretz Israel in the Pre-Constantinian period. Yuval.
Thank you, Jonathan, Dole, and Judy and Martin for inviting me to participate. The God-loving Akeptus has offered this table to the God Jesus Christ as a memorial. Prosenike Akeptus de Philotheos Centropedran Theo Jesu Christo Nemosinum. Akeptus offered this table in the Christian community building that had been founded in the middle of the 3rd century near the Megiddo crossroads. You can see it, and is now in the yard of the present-day Megiddo prison. Thus I begin my discussion from the starting point of the excavations there, headed by Yotam Tepper between 2003 up to 2005, and the inscriptions that were unearthed by his team and read by Lea Segni. I thank Yotam and the Israel Antiquities Association for their kind permission to use the first 3 slides. It is from the original publication in 1906. This community building is situated at the edge of Kfar Otnai, a village where most of the residents were Jews and Samaritans. Only a narrow lane, 2 meters wide, divided the Jewish and Samaritan villagers from the Christian community, which had some connection with the nearby Roman legionary camp. What did the villagers know about their new neighbors who lived there for about 50 years during the 3rd century? We can assume that they knew something about people who lived across the lane, whose buildings towered high over the village houses, and whose architecture was so different from theirs. But as a matter of fact, as a representative of the Jews here, I have to admit that I do not know what the Jews of Kfar Otnai knew about their Christian neighbors, simply because they have told me nothing about it. Thus, I should really now thank you for your attention and leave the stage for the next speaker. Nevertheless, the dating of the building and the Christian community there to the 3rd century is a very convenient starting point for me. Because for the historian who wants to follow the development of Christianity in Palestine and the real relationship between Palestinian Jews and Christians in the 1st century, the 3rd century is preferable to both the founding era of Christianity in the 1st and 2nd centuries and to the Christian political breakthrough in the 4th and 5th centuries. The 1st and 2nd centuries are very important above all because of the information of Christian theology, mainly through the creation and crystallization of the New Testament. But for the historian, this is also a weak point, because their theology overshadows, indeed almost hides, the historical situation, especially in Palestine. This is why the historical reconstruction of this early period is so controversial, especially concerning the relationship between Jews and Christians. It is sufficient to note how little we really know about the two most important Christian churches in Palestine, Caesarea and Jerusalem Aliyah, in the 2nd century. The only real knowledge about the Church of Palestine after the destruction of the Second Temple comes from 189 CE, from the days of its bishop Narcissus. Eusebius, the father of Christian historiography in the 4th century, admits that, quote, the chronology of the bishops of Jerusalem I have nowhere found preserved in writing, for tradition says that they were all short-lived, unquote. This lack of information stands in sharp contrast to Eusebius' knowledge about the three other major churches he described, Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. The first time we hear the voice of the bishops of Jerusalem is in the 90s of the 2nd century, in a letter written together with the Bishop of Caesarea about the controversy over Pascha, which is about 100 years later than the well-documented political and theological involvement of the bishops of Rome and Antioch. Of course, due to the personality and creativity of Origen, we know a lot about the Church of Caesarea from the 30s of the 3rd century. From the Jewish side, it would seem at first glance that we can listen to the Tannaitic Talmudic sources from the 2nd century and identify the Minim as Christians, but this identification is doubtful and most controversial. On the other hand, the blog of our reporter on the Christian affairs in the Jerusalem Talmud relates directly to Jesus for the first time. Later on, I shall deal with one source in the Tosefta, which related also to Jesus, but seems to reflect the reality of the 3rd century. The disadvantage of looking at the 4th and 5th centuries on this subject is above all related to the Christian political and demographic breakthrough. Once Christianity becomes the state religion, Jerusalem and the Holy Land becomes the center of the imperial interest and propaganda, which overshadow local natural development. I refer here to the two processes of monasticism and pilgrimage, which were the two main agents of the Christianization of the Palestine from the second half of the 4th century on. Another limitation to our knowledge from the second half of the 4th century is the fact that the creation of the Jerusalem Talmud, the main voice of Palestinian Jewry, now comes to a full stop, and we have no proper substitute. In comparison to the disadvantages of both these earlier and later periods, stand the advantages of the 3rd century. Jews and Christians now speak both on behalf of themselves and about each other, historically and theologically. This is the height of the process of the making of the Jerusalem Talmud, the X-ray department of Palestinian Jewry in the 3rd and 4th centuries, or perhaps I should say MRI or CT. There is no such meeting of sources from both sides earlier, nor from the end of the 4th century on, after the Jerusalem Talmud falls silent. Encouraged by this illumination, I shall remain on the stage and go back to part 9. The Talmudic Jew knows about the connection between this village and the Samaritans, Hittim. Mishnah Gittin. All documents that have Kutean as a witness are invalid except for writs of divorce and bills of emancipation. There was a case of a writ of divorce that was brought from Rabban Gamliel at Parotnai. The witnesses were Kuteans. He declared it valid. His son, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, in the middle of the 2nd century, allowed the use of vegetables of the Samaritans for tithes, again in Parotnai. On the other hand, there is not even the slightest hint of Christians in the village or its vicinity. At this point, we shall widen our scope to meetings between Jews and Christians in the 3rd century in general, from the point of view of the Jew, whose voice we hear in the Talmudic literature, mainly in the early Palestinian sources, and especially, again, in the Facebook or blog, which he opened in the Jerusalem Talmud. In accordance with our topic, which deals with Christianity, I want to ask my Jews 3 questions. What, where, and how far? What do we know, or what do you want to tell me about Christians? Where do you usually meet them? How far do they affect you or concern you? So what does our Talmudic Jew tell us about Christianity? In the early Palestinian sources, but only from the 3rd century on, Jesus was a bastard, the son of Pantera, and people healed others in his name. This was condemned as sorcery. In the Babylonian Talmud and later sources, the picture is extended. He was the bastard son of Pantera, people are healed in his name. He himself was a sorcerer and seducer. He was hanged on Passover. He had pupils who taught his doctrines, which were termed the Avon Gelionim, the news of sin, rather than Eu Angelion, the good news. And in one source, Jesus is also portrayed as close to the authority, namely the Roman authority. In fact, there is only one relevant Palestinian tradition in both Tosefta and Jerusalem Talmud, and also in Ecclesiastes Rabbah. There was a case with Rabbi Lazar ben Dama, who was bitten by a snake, and Jacob of Kfar Samak came to heal him in the name of Jesus, son of Pantera. And Rabbi Ishmael didn't allow him. He said to him, "You are not permitted, ben Dama." He said to him, "I shall bring you proof that he may heal me." But he did not manage to bring the proof before he died. Said Rabbi Ishmael, "Happy are you, ben Dama, for you have expired in peace, and you did not stick down the hedge of sages." And there is another, on the same place, another story about Rabbi Eliezer, and you can see that it is very similar to the first one. Of course, it is reasonable to assume that there were Jews in Palestine that knew much more about the Christian tradition and Christological exegesis of the Old Testament. But the direct Talmudic relations to this is very limited. This could have been due to later self or Christian censorship, but this is unlikely for 2 reasons. One, the fact that the heavy censorship of the printed versions of the Babylonian Talmud did not delete the anti-Christian blogs there. Second, the tradition about Jesus the bastard, son of Pantera, should also have been deleted by this alleged censorship, and the fact that this extent cancels out the possibility of censorship. There is parallel contemporary documentation of this Jewish anti-Christian language, namely Jesus, son of Pantera, in origin, in Contra Calcium, in the first half of the 3rd century, and later on, in the 4th century, in the Panarion of Epiphanes. Where how a Jew could meet a Christian in Palestine. Most of the relevant sources are in Eusebius, who wrote in the early 4th century, but presumably also reflects the reality of the later 3rd century. We know of Christians in Caesarea and Alia, Jerusalem, and Akop Ptolemais at the end of the 2nd century. During the persecution in the first decade of the 4th century, we find Christians in the following places from north to south. Scythopolis, Scythopolis, Caesarea, Jerusalem, Diospolis Lod, Eleuteropolis, and the nearby village Ainea, Yamnia, Ascalon, and Gaza. In the Council of Nicaea, we hear of bishops from Caesarea and Aelia, first of all, and also from Capitolias, Gadara, Scythopolis, Kabulun or Zebulun, Maximianopolis, Sebastia, Neapolis, Diospolis, Nicopolis, Eleuteropolis, Jericho, Yamnia, Azotus, Ashkelon, Gaza, and Eilat, which is beyond the net. Thus, daily meetings with Jews could have taken place above all in Caesarea, Kfar Otnai, adjacent to Maximianopolis, Scythopolis Bet Shean, Nicopolis Lod, and Eleuteropolis Bet Shean. Less clear but possible could be meetings in Jericho, Azotus, Ascalon, Gaza, Gadara, and maybe also in Yamnia. The onomasticon of Eusebius allows us to look at southern Judah, especially southern Mount Hebron. Eusebius notes the ethnic affiliations of 14 settlements. Most of them are villages. 11 of Jews, 2 Christians, and 1 Samaritan. 7 of the Jewish and the 2 Christian villages are located in southern Judea, so this is another region where Jewish-Christian meetings could have taken place. On the other hand, it is beyond doubt that most of the non-Jews that a Jew might meet would have been pagans or Samaritans. The latter are noted especially in Scythopolis Bet Shean, Caesarea, and Kfar Otnai. Not a single one of the above settlements is located in what was the Jewish arena par excellence in the relevant period. Lower Galilee, the basin of the Kinneret, and eastern Upper Galilee. Since our period, the 3rd century before Christian pilgrimage took off, the Galilean Jew not only had no Christian neighbors, but he would not even have met a solitary pilgrim on the road, not to mention a group of pilgrims. The fact that there are so few Christian Talmudic sources which deal directly with Christianity brings us to our third question about how much was our Jew really affected or concerned by Christianity and Christians. Or to go back to the title of my paper, what role did Christianity play in the world of Jews in Eretz Israel in the pre-Constantinian period? Let us examine this issue through the attitude of 2 major sages in 2 polls with both Jewish and Christian communities in the 3rd century, Rabbi Shamlai or in Diospolis Lod, and Rabbi Abau in Caesarea. Rabbi Abau on the Minim. Rabbi Shamlai on the Minim. Minim asked Rabbi Simlai or Shamlai, how many Elohut created the world? He answered them, are you asking me? Go and ask the first Adam. It is not written God created man on the earth, but from the day that God created man on the earth. They said to him, but it is written in the beginning Elohim, I think it's plural form, created. He said to them, it is not written Elohim Baru in plural, but Elohim Bara. Said Rabbi Simlai, in every instance that Minim have raised the question out of Scripture, the answer is right beside it in Scripture. Minim returned and asked him, what is this is written, what is this that is written El Elohim, Yahweh, El Elohim, Yahweh, he knows? He answered them, it is not written they know, but he knows. And then he was asked by students, Rabbi, this you pushed away with stick of straw. What can you answer us? He said to them, all three are one name, as if a man would say Basileus, Caesar, Augustus. It would appear that Rabbi Shimlai's Minim are actually Christians, which goes nicely with the first historical evidence for a Christian community in Lod. The discussion in this sugya, it is not on the screen, goes from the Minim of Rabbi Shamlai back to Rabbi Yehuda bar Simon, who dealt with pagans and their idolatry. Thus, the Talmudic sources on law show a historical process from the 2nd century Minim and their books. You can look in the books of Minim, which Rabbi Tarfon in Lod in the 2nd century is related to. So the historical process are from these Sifrei Minim that were fiercely condemned by Rabbi Tarfon to the pagans that concern Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi and Rabbi Simon in the middle of the 3rd century. Then the Minim are Christians of Rabbi Shamlai, one generation later, and up to the Byzantine period, when according to Lamentation Rabbah, the Lord has commanded concerning Jacob that they that are found about him should be his adversaries, like Halamish unto Nabeh, Castra unto Haifa, Susita unto Tiberias, Jericho unto Noaran, and Lod unto Ono. And now we are moved to Rabbi Abahu on Christians and Christianity. Rabbi Abahu said, if a man says to you, I am God, he is a liar. If he says, I am a son of man, in the end he will regret it. If he says, I will go up to heaven, he said, but shall not perform it. And also that one, in short of time, I'm not reading. The Minim asked Rabbi Abahu, but even Rabbi Abahu, the head of the Bet Midrash study house in Caesarea and one of the most prominent Jewish leaders in the turn of the 3rd and 4th centuries, refers more to pagans, Romans, and especially Samaritans, to him, than to Christians. There are at least 6 Antiquity traditions reported in the name of Rabbi Abahu, and the most important one attests his central role in the ban against Kutean wine. You can see it here. I'm not going to read it. The most important is there. They ask why Rabbi Abahu prohibited there, namely Samaritan wine. And it's written, there are those who wish to explain as follows: when Diocletian, the king, came up here, he issued a decree saying every nation must offer a libation except for Jews, so the Samaritans made a libation, and that is why the wine was prohibited. And at last, even he was asked, Rabbi Abahu was asked, Zer Kutan's halut, is it permitted? And he answered, if only I could forbid the water as well. So he liked Kutan's, as you can see. I've argued elsewhere that this ban on the Kutan wine is a product of the anti-Christian persecutions in Palestine, which took place mainly in Caesarea. Similar meetings between Jews, Samaritans, and pagans in the same time and place appear in the Syriac version of the Martyrs of Caesarea by Eusebius. When it describes the martyrdom of Paul in the 6th year of the persecutions, he writes, after this, Paul offered up prayer for our enemies, the Jews, many of whom at that time were standing around him. Then he went on in his supplication and prayed for the Samaritans and for those among the Gentiles who were without knowledge. All the other Palestinian Amoraim from the 3rd and early 4th centuries, most of whom are Galileans, especially from Tiberias and Sepphoris, continue to deal with pagans and Kuteans and completely ignore Christians and Christianity. They are affected and concerned by mutual relationship and rivalry with other Talmudic centers in Palestine and Babylon. The dichotomy Jew versus non-Jew is the topic of Ishai. The relationship between Jews and Samaritans, Yehuda and Rome, but only marginally with Judaism and Christianity. And as we have already seen, only in place outside Galilee. This picture is quite similar to the role of real as opposed to conceptual or symbolic Jews in the Historia Ecclesiastica of Eusebius, as well defined by Marie Verdonner. Quote, communication between Jews and Christians is practically non-existent in Historia Ecclesiastica. In reality, after the story of Jerusalem's destruction, the theme of the destiny of the Jews is ended, and they only play a marginal part in the rest of the world. Thus, the Jews are written out of Historia Ecclesiastica. Unquote. Indeed, through the Christian lens of Eusebius, the pagans, apart from the Christian heresies, played a concrete and much more significant role than the Jews. They were the enemy. Similar to the relationship between the Jewish centers, Batei Midrash and Yeshivot, mutual relationship and rivalry is a central theme among the main churches in Palestine between Caesarea and Jerusalem. The build-up of political Christianity and the foundation of monasticism and pilgrimage are products of the second third of the 4th century, together with the first monumental churches, the Holy Sepulchre at the very heart of Jerusalem, Eleone on the Mount of Olives, the Nativity in Bethlehem, and Mamre to the north of Hebron. Christian architectural expression through church and monastery building begins to accelerate in the second half of the 4th century and really takes off from the 5th century. In 407, Jerome contrasts the ruins of Jewish temple where the Jews mourn with the rebuild of Christian city of Jerusalem, where, I quote, the crowd of believers in Christ see now roofs of churches arising daily, like the roof of the Christian building in Parotnai in the middle of the 3rd century. But this process is beyond the scope of the Jerusalem Talmud, and unfortunately we lack another comparative Jewish-Palestinian mirror to reflect the new phase of Jewish-Christian relationship.